Welcome friends to another r/malicious compliance video. If you like puppies, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons down below. And if you don't, make sure to do it anyways and support the channel. And our first story of the day is by Gringa Ellie. I have to claim mileage from the office, not home? Okay. I used to be sent out on training a few times a year, and I could claim mileage at a set rate per mile. At the time, most people working at this place lived in a town 5 miles north of the office, and training tended to be in a large city about 60 miles south of the office. At the time, I lived halfway between the office and the city, so 30 miles south of the office, 30 miles north of the city where the training was. So I was only claiming 60 miles expenses for every trip, home, city, home, rather than 120 miles, office, city, office. So finance went on a cost-saving drive and announced that we had to claim mileage office, city, office, with their reasoning being that the majority of staff who lived 5 miles north would have been paying for their own fuel to get to the office, so they shouldn't be claiming those extra 5 miles 2 times on a training day. I understood the reasoning for it, but assumed that as I was so far south, they'd still accept the 60-mile claim from me. Boy, was I wrong, and I was completely reamed out the next time I put in a claim. Despite pointing out that I was saving them money, I was accused of trying to defraud the company. I was told to redo my claim sheet and then they wouldn't put a formal warning on my employee file this time. So instead of taking it higher, I was now being paid double in mileage and saving 60 miles of fuel on not driving to the office on training days. I complied. A few months later, my boss wasn't in, so I had to get her boss to sign my travel expenses. He asked why I was claiming the office city office when I lived so much closer. I explained what had happened and he was upset, but signed it and told me he'd take it to finance for me as he was heading that way. A policy amendment was emailed out to all staff later that day, stating that on training days, we were to claim either home city office or office city office, whichever was shorter. Oh well, the extra money was nice when I got it. Be honest guys, if they changed the policy and told you, no matter what, you have to do it this way, even though you know that would cost them more money and put more money in your wallet, would you just go along with it knowing that you're profiting more off of it until they notice? Let me know in the comments down below. Our next story is by ICD. Compliance with company timesheet requirements resulted in 40% pay increase. I've been a freelance contractor for over 30 years in the UK and worked for many companies, usually on an hourly or daily rate. About 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to work for a client on a 6-month contract on a daily rate and also to work from home, except for some site visits for meetings. Since I was working from home, I was able to work my own hours. I was judged basically on my output, not the bum hours on seat. I would work whenever I wanted, an hour here or there, multiple breaks during the workday, and also sometimes at weekends whenever I felt like it. However, I ensured that I at least complied with the 40 hours a week minimum, even though I was on a daily rate. The way that it worked on this contract was that I would submit my timesheet for my boss to sign, that would be sent to my agency, and they would do all the work to create invoices to the end client and pay me based on how long I worked that week. I didn't have to submit invoices to the agency. They used something called self-invoicing. Now, because of the hassle of trying to record all the start times, times for breaks, etc., it was a pain to fill in the client's timesheet, which only allowed for 1 start time, 1 lunch break, 1 end time. So, because I was on a daily rate, I would just record a standard 9 to 17:30 start and stop and 30-minute lunch for every weekday, knowing that I was putting in the hours and not cheating the client. This was all well for a couple of months. My boss would sign the timesheet, the agency would invoice the client and just send me the money each month. At some point, I would reconcile my books, noting the payments against my days worked. The compliance. At some point, my boss balked at how I was filling in my timesheet and asked for it to be more detailed. This is where the malicious compliance took over. I would carefully record all the periods I was working, which I did anyway, and then create a timesheet for the week. This resulted in several pages of timesheets rather than the previously 5 lines, now showing all periods I worked, all breaks I took, total hours for each day, total hours for the week. My boss would need to check all of this and sign it, and we continued that way for a while. The fallout. Now, you may think that this was only a small malicious compliance. It took me extra effort to comply, my boss got the detailed timesheet he required, and nothing changed. However, there was an unexpected consequence of this compliance which was rooted in the contract I had signed. and the contract that the client had signed with the intermediate agency. It came down to the definition of a working day. Remember, I was on a daily rate, not an hourly rate, even though the client insisted on a breakdown of all my hours. After a few months, when I tried to reconcile my own company's books, it seemed that I was getting paid more than I expected, 40% more to be precise. When I investigated, it turned out that I had overlooked my contract that stated that I was paid a full day's contract rate, irrespective of how many hours I worked on that day. So say if I happened to work 10 hours, I would just get the day rate. But if I only worked for an hour, I would still get the full day rate. Since I was now giving a timesheet that also detailed the few hours I might work on Saturday and Sunday, as well as the 5 work days, even though I was only working a total of 40 hours, I was getting paid for 7 days rather than 5 days. I decided not to bring it to the notice of my boss, since I doubt he had visibility of the invoices. He was just signing off my timesheet every week. This resulted in an unexpected pay raise for the final couple of months of my contract. I just wish I complied earlier in my contract. It's a little underhanded to do it this way, but hey, you're complying with exactly what they wanted you to do. And I guess at the end of the day, you can feign ignorance and be like, well, I didn't know that was supposed to happen. I was just doing what the boss told me to. I know I wouldn't complain about a free 40% pay increase. Our next story is by Crinks. Follow her work schedule then. I used to be an intern at a bank while I was pursuing my diploma, and on paper, the working hours were supposedly your typical 9 to 6 p.m., but people usually either came late and stayed late or came early and stayed late. There was a colleague of mine, Denise, who would come all the way from Malaysia every morning just to get work in Singapore. There was an unofficial agreement with her boss that she was allowed to enter the office at any time since she was never sure when she could reach her workplace depending on traffic. This was fine since she usually arrived at 12 p.m. and stayed until at least 8 p.m. just like everyone else, and staying past 11 p.m. was the norm here. Just like most people, her day can't start without a cup of coffee, and she would get one no matter what time she arrived. No one had any issues with her coming in late at all until another intern came. Let's call the intern Jane. Now, Jane was the kind of person who hated coming to work early and loved to go home the moment the hand on the clock hit 6. Honestly, so do we, but we don't do it. She loved to gossip with her other colleagues and friends, as well as getting to work at 10 a.m. without any valid reason, with a layer of makeup so thick you could probably slap her and leave a handprint. Other colleagues had already submitted multiple complaints regarding her coming to work late, and her manager was already pissed and sent Jane an email. She was not to come to work late anymore, or her internship would be considered null and void, along with a mention to her supervisor that she would fail that semester as our internship was graded. All of us were on a Teams meeting when she received that email, which led to her outburst. Jane said, "Manager, why can Denise come to work late but I can't? Just because she's a full-time employee doesn't mean she doesn't have to follow the rules." The manager said, "All right, in that case, you get to follow her work schedule then." And Jane said, "Okay, sure." At this point, all of us were amused but horrified by what that entailed, because as interns, we had to send a morning report to our school from our work email at 11 a.m. sharp in the morning with no exceptions. Imagine her surprise when she remembered this the next day and even took a taxi down to rush her report and tried to leave work at 6 p.m., but was reminded by the manager she could only leave at 11 p.m. It didn't take too long for her to realize that when the manager said to follow her, Denise's, work schedule, she meant the staying late part as well. This meant that Jane had to report to work from 10:45 a.m. and could only leave when Denise does at 11 p.m. Heck, I'll never forget her face when she panicked and tried to call our manager up, but was denied resuming her previous working hours as per the verbal agreement, which everyone heard the day before. This continued for roughly a week, with Jane looking wearier and wearier as time went by from coming in an hour later, but only being allowed to leave work 5 hours later. Thankfully, she apologized by then, and our manager was nice enough to let her resume with actual working hours. Throughout the rest of my time there as an intern, she was always punctual and even worked late sometimes. I left before Jane did, and she did eventually become a better person, didn't gossip as much anymore, and was a lot more well-mannered. We added each other on Instagram and still keep in touch. Sometimes all we really need is that kick in the butt, that wake-up moment, that realization that it's not all sunshine and daisies. The bottom line is you reap what you sow. And our final story of the day is by Magnus40. new travel policy to save money ends up costing so much more. My company was on a cost-saving kick and decided to look for ways to shave pennies. Now, they could have looked at the amount of money that was squandered by people jetting all over the country on company time at a huge hourly rate. Basically, the labor spend is always much higher than the cost of flight, car hire, hotel, and food combined, or the number of strategizing away days that HR, etc. went on, but no, they came for the lowly engineers. When the company starts counting paper clips, you know that you're about to have some fun. We were called to a consultation session. Read, we're telling you what we decided based on what we think goes on and not actually what goes on. The session was about saving money on hire cars. In our company, if you have to go away from your home site, you can use your own car and choose a mileage rate up to about a 40-mile journey. If it's longer, then you should have a hire car. Hire cars are usually dropped off at the office by transporter, or you can pick one up at a hire office, or you can get a car dropped off at home for a small fee, 14 pounds plus fuel. Travel department announced that there was going to be no more home drop-offs to save money. The engineers knew how this was going to pan out and said nothing. The thing to know here about the travel department is that they don't travel. None of the knowledge is from the real world. Travel announced that the new policy was that home drop-offs were to cease. We had to pick up the hire car at the office or at the nearest Hertz rental location. Sounds simple. All the engineers who travel a lot could instantly see the issues, but as we were told that this is the new policy, we had to comply. So we did, maliciously. I was on a job 300 miles away at the customer site. I traveled down on the Monday morning starting at 6 a.m. and back up Thursday, home about 6 p.m. Because of the travel time, I got the Friday off. I also lived a 100-mile round trip from the office, and my nearest Hertz office was at the airport. This was not an unusual situation. A lot of people I worked with traveled to client locations. The weekend arrived. Usually at some point over the weekend, a car's dropped off and the key and paperwork are popped through my letterbox for the princely sum of 14 British pounds and no time for me. Instead, because the Hertz office was closed at 6 a.m. on the Monday morning, I picked up the car the day before. Because my wife needed my car while I was away, and therefore could not leave my car parked at the airport, I took a taxi as per company travel policy, 35 pounds and 40 minutes. I picked up the car, about 30 minutes, and drove home, about 30 minutes. On the Thursday evening, instead of heading home and getting the car picked up on the Friday, I headed straight to the airport, dropped off the car, and took a taxi back. 40 pounds and about 40 minutes due to busy traffic. Our expenses are done monthly, so by the end of the month, I have 3 weeks travel to account for, which would have been 3 times 14 pounds, plus a small refueling charge for the trip back to the Hertz office. Instead, they got about 200 pounds for taxi fares and an overtime bill of about 4.5 hours at about 80 pounds per hour. I wasn't the only one. Some engineers took a taxi into the office to pick up the car, as their spouse needed the car while they were away. Some took a taxi to the nearest Hertz office. All of us put in our overtime at the end of the month. Travel has no overtime budget, so it all got claimed from the project. The project labor budget teams went ballistic and went all flaming torches and pitchforks on the travel department. The policy didn't last the day. I mean, it's really easy to see how it would fall apart. You pay a 14-pound delivery fee. People who have a family don't just have the privilege of leaving their car wherever for all that period of time. So the chances are, a significant number of people probably would have to take an Uber, a Lyft, a taxi, and if they can make the company pay for it, they're going to do that, obviously. I feel like that should have been a pretty obvious thing to actually kind of predict when you shift more responsibility onto the employee to get to the rental car. Guess that's what happens when you try to shave pennies. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. So of all these stories I've read today, which is your favorite and why? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't yet, if you could like and subscribe, that would mean a lot to me. Whatever you do, whether it's liking, subscribing, turning notifications on, all of it helps grow this channel and I appreciate the heck out of it. So until next time, I'll see you all tomorrow with some more stories.